Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Tet Zayin. We begin the second perek. Mishnah Kol HaZevachim Shekibelu Daman Zar Onen Tevul Yom Mechusar Kippurim Mechusar Begadim Shelo Rachatz Yadayim V'Raglayim Arel Tameh Yosheb Omed Al Gabe Kelim Al Gabe Behema Al Gabe Ragle Havero Pasal. Any korban in which someone received the blood, this Mishnah is the Mishnah are arranged chronologically. The first perek was talking about shechita, the first thing that you do with the animal, and so this is now focusing on Kabbalah and teaches us that regarding any korban, if a non-Kohen collects the blood, then it's pasul. Not only is it not permitted, but the korban becomes unfit, disqualified. You see that it can only say this regarding Kabbalah, because shechita can be done by a zar. So that's why this has a separate thing regarding Kabbalah and forwards. Kabbalah, holacha, zirika, all have to be done by a Kohen. And then we continue the list. Onen, someone who had a close relative die on that day, that first day is onen, cannot do Kabbalah. Or again, any of the things that come afterwards. And tivul yom, that means someone who was tameh and they went to the mikveh during the day, but they are not fully tahor until the nighttime, cannot do Kabbalah. Mechusar kippurim, that would be someone who, like a zav, who has to do a purification ritual for 7 days, go in the mikveh, but still, even though he's tahor for some purposes, still cannot eat kodashim or come into the mikdash until he brings his korbanot on the 8th day, so that he's lacking atonement. If a kohen is in that state, he also cannot do Kabbalah, and if he does, the korban is pasul. Mechusar begadim, if the kohen is not wearing his bigdei kehuna, or if he did not wash his hands and feet before starting the service, he has to prepare himself by washing in the kiyor. Arel, if he is not circumcised, even if he has a reason not to be health reason not to be circumcised, still he cannot perform a korban and do Kabbalah if he's tameh. Now we know tameh already because we said tivul yom, but this is part of the list, so that's the way of the Mishnah that includes everything, even though we could have figured it out from this tivul yom. Also, if he's sitting, he can't be sitting on the floor and receive the blood. He has to be standing and bend over and receive the blood while standing. And that's true for the other services also. Or he has to have his feet on the floor, directly on the floor of the mikdash. He cannot be standing on a vessel, like standing on a plate. Not allowed. He can't be on an animal because then his feet won't be on the floor. He can't put his feet on top of someone else's feet. Maybe if it's cold out and the floor is cold, he wants to put his feet on top of someone else's. No, his feet have to be directly on the floor. And if he doesn't do that, then the korban is pasul. Kibel bismol pasal Rabbi Shimon machshir. He's supposed to use his right hand. What if he uses his left hand? Tanna Kama says pasul, but Rabbi Shimon says that it's still kosher. Gemara, zar minelan. The first item on the list, a non-Kohen, zar. How do you know that he cannot perform Kabbalah? Detane Levi, Daber el Aharon ve'el banav lemor, v'yinazeru mekodshe b'nei Yisrael ve'gomer. B'nei Yisrael me'ute mai, ile la me'ute nashim, korban nashim betuma karev. Let's look at the pasuk first inside. Vayikra 22 teaches, go and tell B'nei Yisrael, v'yinazeru mekodshe, go tell Aharon, Adaber Aharon ve'el banav. So this is the law to the Kohanim, and they yinazir, like a nazir, but here they're not literally nazir. The verb v'yinaziru means to separate themselves mikodshe b'nei Yisrael, from holy things of Israel, and velo yechalelu et shem kodshi, and not make whole, not desecrate my holy things, asher makdishim li, that they make holy to me. Now, what do you mean they can't? They have to separate from all holy things? Aren't they always dealing with holy things? They're dealing with korbanot. Well, the next pasuk will explain what the circumstances are. And what dorotechem kol isha shirika mikol zarachem lakodashim asher yakdishu b'nei Israel Adonai vetum'ato ala v'nichreta nefesh hahi melefanai ani Adonai. Anybody, your generation, future generations, from all your descendants, who come to holy items, and while they are tameh, they will get karet. So that's what it's talking about. So they have to separate from kodshe b'nei Israel if they are tameh. So that's a simple reading. And here it says mikodshe b'nei Israel, from any sacrifice that someone from Bnei Israel brings. So that seems to be the simple reading. But the question is, why does it have to say Bnei Israel? Why not just say Mikodashim, from anything holy? What is Bnei Israel coming to limit? Is it coming to limit women? That's only the sons of Israel, male korbanot, that they have to stay away from if they're tameh. But if it's for a woman, then they don't have to? That doesn't make sense. A korban brought by a woman, certainly there's many korbanot a woman needs to bring, like if she gave birth. But would you say that it can be brought by a Kohen who's tameh? No way. That's not right. So maybe Bnei Israel as opposed to non-Jews. Non-Jews can bring korbanot. So maybe this means that the Kohanim have to separate from a Jewishly brought korban, but if a non-Jew brings a korban, then a tameh Kohen can sacrifice it. But that doesn't make sense either. Hashta sis lo meratzeh, tamar mor, ubegoyim, ben beshogeg, ben bemezid lo hursa, betuma karev. But that can't be, because there's a law regarding the seats that the Kohen Gadol wears, that the seats will make acceptable any korban that's brought betum'ah. By a Jew. If a Jew brings a korban, so lecha techila, the Kohen is supposed to be tahor. What if b'di avad, he wasn't tahor? Now what are you going to do with this korban? So the law is that the seats that the Kohen Gadol wears makes it okay that the korban will still be valid. That's true if a Jew brings it. But we have a tradition that regarding sacrifices that are brought by a non-Jew, they're bringing the animal, and a Kohen who's tameh sacrifices it, whether by mistake or on purpose, the seats will not permit it. Now, if that's true, when it's done, even b'di avad, the seats will not fix a non-Jew's korban that's brought betum'ah, then all the more so, lecha techila, it's not going to be good. So we see from this law that if a non-Jew brings a korban, the Kohen still has to be tahor to bring that. Therefore, the word Bnei Israel is not coming to exclude women, not coming to exclude that of a non-Jew. All korbanot have to be brought by a Kohen who is tahor. It doesn't matter who is bringing it. We will see an exception later on that if it's a korban sibur, if it's a communal offering, and there's nobody that's tahor, then a tameh can do it. But these categories, there's no exceptions, so Bnei Israel is not coming to exclude them. El hachika amar v'inaziru mikodsheh Bnei Israel v'lo yichalelu. Rather, the word Bnei Israel, we're going to read it, we're going to repunctuate, and say the Kohanim, they have to separate from Kodashim if they're Tameh. And then another law, right, period. Bnei Israel have to also separate from all Korbanot, and if they don't separate, and and a Zar comes and does Kabbalah, or any of the next ones, then it will become Chol. So Bnei Israel should keep away from them, so that it doesn't become profane. We learn from that if they do, Zar does something, then it will be Chol. That is the first derivation from Levi. Okay, so that's one. We're going to see a couple more. Deber Rabbi Ishmael Tana. Now, from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, we have a braita that teaches a different derivation, not from this pasuk, but rather from a kal vachomer. We're going to see that the Deber Ishmael, they like to bring kal vachomers. Atya bekal vachomer mi ba'al mum. Ma ba'al mum she'ochel im avad chilel. We bring a kal vachomer from a Kohen who has a blemish. Now, a Kohen who has a blemish, let's say he's missing an arm. He can eat korbanot. He can eat kodashim. It doesn't prevent him from eating. And yet, if a Kohen who has a mum performs a service, then the korban will become desecrated. It will become hol pasul. So there, if starting that as the basis, zar she'eno ochel enodin shim avad chilel, non-Kohen cannot eat kodshe kodashim, like a korban hatat. Only a Kohen can eat it. A zar cannot eat that. So all the more so if he went and did an avodah, that will make it whole, right? If even a Ba'al Mum who can eat, but if he so he's less stringent and he performs a service, it makes it whole. All the more so a Zad who cannot eat will make it whole if he performs a service. So that seems like a good kal vachomer. But now we challenge it. Ma'ale Ba'al Mum sheken asa bo kareb kemakrib. But the Ba'al Mum, there's a stringency in blemishes in that it applies to the Kohen. And also, the law of mum applies to the animal. An animal that's missing a leg also cannot be sacrificed. And that's not true of other laws, like the zar. There's no such thing as a animal that's a Kohen and an animal that's not a Kohen. You don't say this animal cannot be a korban because it's not a Kohen. It doesn't apply to animals. It only applies to people. But the law of blemishes applies to people and also applies to animals. So maybe that's a stringency, and that's the reason why for a Ba'al Mum he cannot perform the activity, but you can't use that as a source for a zar. Okay, tameh yochiach. We'll bring in someone who is tameh, because a Kohen who is tameh also cannot perform a service, otherwise it will be pasul. And tumah can only apply to a person, not to a live animal. That's a law. No live animals can ever become tameh, but a live human being can become tameh. So this will prove that the fact that it applies to an animal or not an animal doesn't really matter. But then we reject this. Ma le tameh sheken mitameh. However, tumah is different because it's contagious, right? If someone's tameh touches someone else, then that person or that food will become tameh. Whereas a zar, being a non-Kohen, is not contagious. If a non-Kohen touches a Kohen, he's not going to make him not a Kohen. So we cannot learn it from tum'ah. Okay, Ba'al Mum yochiach. So we'll bring a blemish, because a blemish is also not contagious. It's if someone without an arm touches someone with an arm, they're not going to get a blemish. And yet Ba'al Mum cannot perform a service. So that'll prove that not being contagious or not contagious doesn't matter. Ve'chazad hadin lo de'izeh k'de'izeh v'lo de'izeh k'de'izeh. So we're going to go round and round, but we see that the key feature in one is not in the other, and the problematic feature in the other is not in this one. Hasada shebehen shemuzharin v'im abdu chilelu afani avizar shum muzhar v'im abad chilel. And so I can see that the common denominator between a Kohen who has a blemish and a Kohen who is tameh is that if they do a service like Kabbalah, then they make the korban no good. So too, I can learn from two of those together to a zar that he cannot perform, and also if he does perform, then the sacrifice is not good. Minalan de muzhar. Now, by the way, how do we know that a zad is not allowed to make a sacrifice? This whole time we were trying to derive that if a zad performs one of the rituals, that it becomes pasul. But this is dependent, and this reasoning is dependent on the fact that he cannot perform in the first place. That's the part of the basis of the kal vachomer. So do we have a source that a zad cannot do Kabbalah? If we're going to learn it from the pasuk that we quoted above in the name of Levi, that pasuk is too good, because that pasuk says not only is a zad not allowed to bring a korban, it also says if he does, it will become hol, it will become pasul. So that you can learn everything from that, as Levi did. But you see that the school of Rabbi Ishmael did not quote that pasuk, but rather they quoted a kal vachomer. Therefore, it must be that they would not learn it from that pasuk, because if they did learn it from that pasuk, they wouldn't need a kal vachomer. So therefore, we need a different source, not this pasuk, to teach us that a zad Zad is not allowed in the first place to do a ritual. Ela mi vezad lo yikrab alechem. Rather, it's pasuk from Bemidbar that says, keep charge of the tent of meeting, whatever the service of the tent may be. But a common man, azad lo yikrab, he cannot come close, he cannot perform these services. So from there, we learn that azad cannot perform the service, and then from the Kal Vachomer above, we can learn that if he does perform a service, then it will become pasul. Now back to that double Kal Vachomer that we brought from a Kohen who is tameh, and the case of a Kohen who has a blemish. Both of those together can teach to a zar. But there's a problem with it. But there is a problem with that because both of those things were not permitted at the time of a bama, whereas a zar was. When bamot were allowed, private altars that were in people's backyards, so then you didn't need a kohen to do it because a member of the household would go and do the korban. And so therefore, during the time of bamot, zad was allowed, but even then, a person, or a member of the household, whoever is doing it, if he has a blemish or a tameh, would not be allowed to make the korban. So you see that maybe the stringency in those two, a blemish and being tameh, is because they have a stringency that they cannot perform even in the time of bamot. Maybe that's why they make it chol if they do it. But a zad who was allowed in the time of bamot to make a korban, so we cannot learn from things that are more stringent to a zad that's less stringent when it comes to a bama. Okay, you know what? Take out tameh and bring instead onen, someone who is their loved one died on that day. And onen, well, we'll see a discussion. But what was the law during the time of bamot regarding an onen? Okay, we'll put that on the side for a second. But we'll use onen and a blemished kohen. But those two cannot perform, and if they do, it'll be chol. And so from those two, we can learn together azar. But that's a problem. Onen has a different stringency in that an onen cannot eat maaser sheni. And that's not true of someone who has a blemished kohen can eat maaser sheni, and azad also can eat maaser sheni. And so the onen has maybe that's why it's stringent. Okay, ba'almum yochiach, but someone who has a blemish will prove that the fact that that doesn't matter. The fact that an onen cannot eat maaser sheni cannot be the key factor that causes an onen to make a korban pasul if he does kabbalah, because after all, a ba'almum can eat maaser sheni, and yet he also, if he does it, he makes it chol. So you see, that's not a key factor. Vechazad hadin. So, but then we will challenge that one as well, and we're going to have to go around and around. Lo di'izeh k'di'izeh sada shevesh shabahen shemuz hadin. So now we'll bring onen and a ba'amum together, and from those two we can learn, just like those two, he's not allowed to do it, and if he does it, it's chol. So too, azad, if he's not allowed, and if he does do a service, it's going to be chol. Hachanami lifroch, but this, we can challenge this. These things also were not permitted in the bama. So you brought in the onen in order to replace the person who is tameh, because a tameh is a problem with bamot. So I brought onen. Yeah, but onen also was not permitted in the time of bamot. So now we have a ba'almum and onen. Both of them were prohibited at the time of bamot, even though azar was permitted. So you cannot learn from those two to azar. Matkif la rab sama bered rava uman le malan de onen asur bebama dilma share bebama. However, Rav Sama, the son of Rava, said, "Oh, hold on. Who told you that an onen cannot perform a sacrifice at the time of bamot? Maybe he's permitted to do so. And if so, he's permitted, then the kal vachomer stands." So there we go. We have in the end a kal vachomer from a ba'almum and from onen. Both of those have different common denominators, they have different key aspects, but the common denominator that it shares with azar is that they cannot perform, and if they perform, the korban is pasul, and therefore that is the solution for the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Okay, that was a second derivation. Now a third derivation, that azar, if he performs the Kabbalah, then the korban is pasul. Rab Meshashia Amar, Atya kava chomer mi yoshev. Ma yoshev she'ochel, im avad chilel, zar she'eno ochel, enodin shim avad chilel. We're going to learn it from someone who's sitting down while doing one of these sacrificial rites. If someone who's sitting down can eat, a Kohen, he can eat korban hatat while he's sitting down. You don't have to stand up for eating. And yet, if he's sitting, he cannot, and does Kabbalah, it will make it pasul. So then, azar, who cannot eat korban hatat or any kodesh kodashim, all the more so, if he performs, it will make it whole. But we reject that kal vachomer. Ma liyoshev sheken pasul le'adut. Wait, someone who is sitting cannot testify. In order to testify, you have to be standing. So there's a stringency regarding sitting that cannot testify, and that does not apply to a zar. Zar can testify, and so you can't learn from Yosheb to a zar. Well, we can learn mi Yosheb Talmid Chacham. There is an exception. See, it's not respectful for someone to be sitting and testifying in front of the court. But let's say someone is a great Torah scholar, and so then it's okay for him to sit while giving testimony, and therefore you can have a Kohen who is sitting and giving testimony. That's fine. So that doesn't make a difference. The fact that because he can sit. So the kal vachomer still stands. A Kohen can eat kodesh kodashim while sitting, and yet if he does a service, it's chol. So a zar who cannot eat kodesh kodashim, he's more stringent, and therefore if he performs a service, it should be chol. Ma leshem yoshev sheken pasul la'edut. But then we say, okay, you found one exception where a kohen who is a tamid chacham, yeah, he can give edut. But the category of people sitting down, let's look at the whole category. And in general, the category of someone sitting down cannot give testimony, and therefore the category of sitting down has a stringency, and maybe that stringency is causing this stringent law that someone sitting, if they do a service, it's chol. And don't just look at one example. So what is Rabbi Shashia going to say to that? Well, he could say, Shem Yoshev la parich. No, I don't think that category question is a challenge to a kal vachomer. As long as you can find an example within that category where the particular thing is not a problem, and we found one. Tamid Chacham, he can sit. Therefore, it's not true that anyone sitting cannot testify. There is such a thing as someone who can sit and testify, and therefore your challenge to the kal vachomer is not a challenge, so my kal vachomer is totally fine. That's one answer. Or Rav Meshashia could answer, Vim timsa lomar parich, if you say, yeah, we have to satisfy everything in the category, atya miyoshev umechada mehanach. Well then, I'll just bring another one of the cases, like a Kohen who has a blemish or a tameh, and bring one of those in, because those things are not a problem for testimony, and that'll show the fact that a sitting person can testify is a not insignificant difference, and then we'll bring those two together, and we can uphold the kal vachomer. Ve'yoshev dekasher bebama min elan. How do you know that someone sitting was permitted to offer a sacrifice at the time of bamot? This is a problem, because if you say that someone sitting was not allowed to do a ritual during the time of bamot, then that would destroy the kal vachomer. You can't bring a proof from Yoshev because it has a stringency that it was applied during the time of bamot, but zar did not apply during the time of bamot. So therefore, we have to show that someone sitting was permitted to do sacrifice sacrificial services at the time of Bamot. So how do we know that? Amar kera la'amod lifnei Adonai le'shareto lifnei Adonai ve'lo lifnei Bama. Because it says that Hashem separated the tribe of Leviim to stand before Hashem to serve Him. That means when they stand before Hashem, that when they're serving Hashem, they have to stand. So that includes Kohanim. When they're serving before Hashem, making a korban, they have to be standing. But if they're not standing before Hashem in the place of the Mishkan or the Bet HaMikdash, but if they're only standing at a bama, that if they're serving at a bama, then they don't have to stand. So the law of standing is only lifnei Hashem, means in the Bet HaMikdash, but it does not apply to bamot. Next question, onen minelan. How do we know that someone who is onen, that means someone died on that day, or even the next day before burial would also be onen midirabanan, but certainly the day of is onen. How do you know that that person, a Kohen, cannot perform Kabbalah or any of the next services? And if he does, it's pasul. Minelan, dichtib, umina mikdash lo yeseh velo yechalel, ha'acher shelo yasa chilel. Because it says regarding a Kohen Gadol does not leave the mikdash. Even if his 7 closest relatives die, he does not go and become tameh and bury them, but rather he does not leave the Bet HaMikdash. He continues to make a korban, and he does not make it profane. He can do korbanot, totally fine. What do we learn from that? That it only applies to a Kohen Gadol. But a regular Kohen who is in onen and he didn't leave and he did a korban, then he will make it chol. That's a good answer. So that's answer number 1. Rabbi Elazar Amar Mehacha hen hikribu ani ikrabti mekelal di'in hu akrib shapir istaruf. Rabbi Elazar has a different source, and he learns it from this conversation here. We're talking about during the day of the consecration of the Mishkan. If you say it was Rosh Chodesh, then this Seir HaChatat was a Seir HaChatat. You have to bring on Rosh Chodesh. Now, Moshe gave instructions to Aaron and his sons. Here's what you have to do. And then, as they're doing it, Moshe is the mashgiach, making sure they do everything correct. When it comes to the Sira Chatat, Darosh Tarash Moshe v'nei Soraf, he looks around and he sees that it was totally burnt, not eaten, even the parts that you're supposed to eat. Korban Chatat, the Kohanim are supposed to eat. And he got angry. Al Elazar v'ali Tamar b'nei Aaron notarim lemor madua lo achaltem et hachatat b'mkom hakodesh. Right? So look at how he's getting angry at Elazar and Itamar in particular, not Aharon. Why didn't you eat the chatat in the holy place? Ki kodash kodashim hi. It is kodash kodashim. It's a chatat, so you should eat it. And Hashem gave it to you. Laset et avon ha'edah. You're supposed to eat it, and that will atone for the people. Hen lo ba'adamai la kodesh penima. This is not the type of korban chatat that's sprinkled inside. That has a different law that you wouldn't eat. But this one is sprinkled outside. You're supposed to eat it. Bakodesh kasher siveti, as I told you. And now, interestingly, Aharon answers, not Elazar and Itamar. So that's the hint of this midrash. He says, Hen hayom ikribu et chatatam bet olatam lifnei Adonai v'tikrena oti ka'ele v'achalti chatat hayom hayta b'nei Adonai. The simple reading of this word hen is behold, or indeed, today, yes, we made sacrifices, chatat and olah, before Hashem, but look what happened to me today. Nadav and Avihu died. I'm in no state to be able to come to eat. Eating the korban chatat, eating meat, that's like, it's a celebratory thing. You have to eat meat. And I'm onen, and I cannot bring myself to do this and eat meat when this tragedy just happens to me. You think Hashem would want that? And Moshe listens, he says, you're right, it's okay. Okay, that's a simple reading of it. That's why they, Aharon was supposed to eat from it. But the Midrash is going to read this word hen, not as indeed or behold, but rather hen, they. And it's going to explain that Moshe was trying to figure out why it was burnt. And he figured, it must be that this was sacrificed by Elazar and Itamar, the surviving children, and they are regular Kohanim. They're not Kohen Gadol, so they are Onenim. This is their brother, their brother has died, so they're Onenim, and they made the sacrifice sacrifice as onenim, and that's why they burnt it, because it's pasul. And that we can learn from here that if indeed that were the case, if they had offered it, then because they were onenim, then it would indeed be pasul, and then it would make sense that they burnt it. And then Aharon comes and says, Hen hayom hikribu et chatatam vet olatam. As a question, Hen, do you think that they, Elazar and Itamar, are the ones that did it? No, I did it. I made the korban. And really, I would be allowed. But I still didn't eat it because of this terrible tragedy that happened to me today. So all that's included in these words. Rabbi Elazar says, we're going to learn it from Hen hikribu, from Aharon's response. Moshe, do you think we burnt it because Elazar and Tamar made the korban and therefore it's pasul? No, I did. I made the korban. What do we learn from here? That if indeed Elazar and Itamar, as regular Kohanim, but Onenim would have sacrificed it, then it would indeed be pasul, and then it would be proper to have been burnt. That's where Rabbi Elazar learns it. Now, Rabbi Elazar, my Tamar lo amar mi Mumin Hamikdash lo yaseh. Amar lach mi ketib ha'acher shelo yaseh chilel. How come Rabbi Elazar does not accept the first derivation from the fact that it says regarding Kohen Gadol that if he's an onen, he doesn't leave and he can make a sacrifice and it won't be chol? And Rabbi Elazar will say, yeah, but I know it says that for Kohen Gadol, but does it say explicitly, and therefore a regular Kohen does make it chol? You made an inference, but I don't know if that inference is true. Maybe it's just telling me the law regarding a Kohen Gadol, that he cannot become tameh. But maybe other Kohanim, they can become tameh, but maybe they don't have to. Maybe a Kohen who is on onen, but he decides not to go to the cemetery, maybe he can make a korban. I don't know. So ve'idach. And how about the other sage who's anonymous? How come he didn't agree with Rabbi Elazar's derivation from Hen hikribu? My ta'ama lo amar me Hen hikribu kasabar mipnei tum'ah nisrefa. Because he has a different reading. This is a machloket later in the Masechet about this reading. And according to this reading, Moshe's assumption when he came in was, why did you burn it? Is it because it was tameh? Is that why? Because you were tameh, and that's why you didn't burn it? That was his assumption. And then Aaron says, no, not because of that. It's because I had this loss today. So from there, we can only learn that if it were tameh, then it would be a pasul. But you can't learn anything from here about onen, because that wasn't what Moshe was thinking. Again, the school of Ishmael, they like to bring kal vachomer, and they bring it, a kal vachomer from a Kohen who has a mum. Ma ba'amum she'ochel im abad chilel. A Kohen who's a ba'amum, he can eat from kodesh kodashim. But if he does a service, Kabbalah, he will make it pasul. So then, onen she'eno ochel, and odin shim abad chilel, onen who cannot eat from kodashim, or all the more so if this is more stringent, all the more so if he did a service, he will make it pasul. But we can reject that. Ma'ale ba'amum sheken asabo kerebin kemakribin. Ba'amum is different because it applies not only to kohanim, it applies also to animals. Whereas being an onen does not apply to animals. An animal who lost his brother doesn't go into mourning. It could still be brought as a sacrifice. So that's why the ba'amum has the stringency that he makes a korban pasul. Now, zar yochiach. Let's bring in a non-kohen. Because azar, that does not only applies to people, doesn't apply to animals. So you see that the fact that it applies to animals does not make a difference. No, but azar is different because you can't change it. There's no remedy. Once someone is a non-kohen, they're a non-kohen forever. But onen is temporary. You just wait till tomorrow and then he won't be an onen anymore. So azar has that stringency. Ba'amum yochiach, but a kohen who has a temporary blemish will show that it doesn't matter that this is permanent. That's not the reason for the stringency. And so, some kohen with a temporary blemish is like a onen, that while he has a blemish right now, he cannot perform services, and if he does, he will make it pasul, so to an onen. Even though it's temporary, and tomorrow he won't be an onen, still, while he's an onen, he cannot perform his service, and if he does, he will make it pasul. Ve'chazar hadin ve'lo re'izeh kere'izeh ve'lo re'izeh kere'izeh hasad hasheveh shebehen shehen muzharin ve'im abdu chilelu afani abi onen shemuzhar ve'im abad chilel. So now we're going to challenge the Baal Mum again, and then we're going to bring a zar again, but the factors from which you challenged from Zad and Baal Mum are absent in the other one. So we could take the common denominator between the Zad and the Baal Mum, and the common denominator is that they cannot perform these avodot, and if they did, it makes the korban pasul. Therefore, I can learn from both of them that an onen who is not allowed to bring a korban, if he does one of these services, it will make the korban pasul. Now we go on a tangent to ask, Kechan muzhar, where do we see that an onen cannot perform a korban? Maybe you learn it from the pasuk that says a Kohen Gadol, he cannot leave. He does not leave the Bet HaMikdash. Even if he's an onen, he makes sacrifices. He does not make it chol. And we learn from there that a regular Kohen does make it chol. This pasuk is too good, because not only does this pasuk say that an onen cannot perform services, it also says that a regular Kohen who's an onen, will make it chol. And then I know everything already. I don't need a kal vachomer. But for the school of Bishmael, he said, I'm going to learn it from a kal vachomer. So evidently, he didn't learn the basic law from this pasuk. Rather, he can learn it from the story when Aaron assumes that, why did you burn it? Is it because you were onenim? Right? The sons were onenim? That's why? And then Aaron says, no, that's not the reason. He gives a different reason. But we can learn from here that if that had been the case, indeed, an onen who made sacrifice, it would have to be burnt because it was pasul. Okay, now back to that kal vachomer. Ika lemifrach, we can reject this kal vachomer. Malesad hasheveh shebehen sheken lo hutera mikela lo. A kohen with a blemish and a zar, both of them have no exceptions. There is no exception. A kohen, it doesn't matter if he's a regular kohen or a kohen gadol, any kohen who has a blemish. And there's no exception. It doesn't matter if he's a king or the biggest rabbi or a judge. No zar can offer a korban. But when it comes to an onen, there is an exception, because a kohen gadol who is an onen can perform these rituals. So maybe those two are more stringent in that they have no exceptions, and you cannot learn from that to the law of onen. Well, tameh yochiach, we can bring in a kohen who's tameh, because that does have an exception. If everybody is tameh, and when it comes to a korban sibur, then a kohen who's tameh can perform it. So that has an exception, and yet if a kohen is tameh and performs, it will make it, except for that circumstance, will make it pasul. So too, an onen will make it pasul. Malatameh sheken metameh, but tumah has a stringency in that it's contagious, whereas onen is not contagious. If you touch another person, that person doesn't become an onen. Hanach yochicho, but the other two that we had before will prove, because those are not contagious. Vechazad hadin, and we go around and round until we see what's the common denominator. Hasad hasheveh shebehen shemuz hadin. The combinator of all three together is that they cannot perform these avodot, and if they do, they will make it a pasul. So too an onen is not allowed to perform, and if he does, will make it pasul. Velifroch malesad hasheveh shebehen sheken lo huteru mikela lan esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid. But we can still reject this triple kal vachomer, because the common denominator between all of them, including in them, is tumah, is that there is no permission in any of them for a kohen gadol to offer an individual korban. However, for an onen, even if a Kohen Gadol is onen, he can offer any korban, even an individual korban. Whereas tum'ah, that is only permitted for regular kohanim regarding a communal korban. So we can reject this because tum'ah, all of them have a stringency, whereas onen has this leniency that a Kohen Gadol can do a private korban, and therefore maybe onen, if he does one of these rites like Kabbalah, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's not pasul. And the answer is Shem Tumah Miha Ishterai. No, nevertheless, the category of Tum'ah, it does have permission when it comes to a regular Kohen for a public. So even though, yes, not for a private one, but within the category, there is such a thing. And therefore, Tum'ah in general will show that this cannot be a reason for Onen being more lenient, because Tum'ah has a similar leniency to Onen, in that there is some case where a Tameh Kohen can offer a korban, and therefore this triple source will stand as a Kal Vachomer. Now, third source, Rab Meshashia Amar. Here's where I can learn the law of Onen. Acha beKal Vachomer mi yoshev. Rab Meshashia likes this source. He did it last time for Zad also, and now he brings a parallel one for Onen from someone sitting. Ma yoshev shoachel im abad chilel. If a Kohen Gadol sits, a Kohen is permitted, a regular Kohen is permitted to sit and eat Kodesh Kodashim, that's okay, but yet, if he's sitting while doing a service, it makes it pasul. Onen shenochel enodin shimavad chilel. Onen cannot eat korbanot. So he's more stringent. Therefore, if he would perform a service, it would make it chol. Mali yosheb sheken pasul edut. No, but we can reject this because someone sitting has a different stringency in that he cannot be a witness. Miyosheb tamid chacham. No, it's not true across the board. There is a case of someone who can sit and be a witness, and so therefore you see that's not a stringency. If he's a sage, he can sit and be a witness. Ma leshem yosheb sheken pasul laedut. Yeah, but that's only one exception. And for the general category of someone sitting cannot be a witness, and maybe that's why it has the stringency that if he sits while doing an avodah, it's pasul. But we would not necessarily apply that to an onen. Shem Yosheb La Parich. And the answer is Rab Meshashia says, I'm not going to reject my Kal Vachomer from the whole category. I don't need it to be true for a whole category, as long as I can find something, a case in that category where someone can sit. So that's enough for me to show that that is not a key factor in making it more stringent. And if you say that, no, it has to fulfill every case in the category, no problem. So then we can prove onen from someone sitting and from some one of the other cases from tum'ah. You'll bring that because someone tameh can testify, and you'll show that that's not a key factor. So one way or another, we can uphold the Kal Vachomer of Rab Mesharshia. Onen pasul. Now we're going to continue to analyze the case of onen, that if a Kohen is in acute mourning of that day and he performs a sacrifice and he does Kabbalah, then the sacrifice will be pasul. Rava gives an interesting limitation on this rule. Amar Rava, lo shanu ela bekorban yachid, aval bekorban sibur meraseh Kal Vachomer mitum'ah. This law only applies to an individual korban. A person brings an individual korban, like he promises to bring an olah, and he brings it. But for a communal sacrifice, like a korban tamid, if a kohen takes the blood while onen, then it's kosher, it's valid. That's surprising. How does he know that? He makes a Kal Vachomer from tum'ah as follows. Ma tum'ah shelo hutera mikelala esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid, hutera esel hediot bekorban sibur. When it comes to tum'ah, we see a stringency in that there is no permission for a kohen gadol who's tameh to bring a korban yachid. But even though it has that stringency, still a regular kohen who is tameh can bring a communal offering. So if so, let's compare that to aninut. Sheutera mikelala esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid. A kohen gadol who is in onen is permitted to bring a korban yachid, and therefore you see that aninut is less stringent than tum'ah. Therefore, we should certainly apply this permission, and odin shu tera esel kohen hedyot bekorban sibur, if a regular Kohen can bring a Korban Sibur while Tameh, then all the more so Aninut should be more lenient, and a regular Kohen should be able to bring a Korban Sibur when he is in Onen. And therefore, Rava concludes that this prohibition of an Onen, and not only prohibition that is pasul, applies only to a Kohen making a Korban Yachid. But if it's a Korban Sibur, then the sacrifice will be kosher. Since it's kosher when it comes to Tum'ah in Sibur, so all the more so it should be kosher if the Kohen is Onen, if it's a Korban Sibur. That's Rava's logic. However, Matkif la Rava bar Ahilai, a different Rava bar Ahilai, is going to reject it. He's going to reject it by showing that the same logic, you take those same elements and you just move them around in a different order, you will come to, you can make a kal vachomer that is patently false. In fact, he's going to show 3 of them, because depending on what you use as your starting point, you can rearrange the elements, but use the same logical structure to create 3 other kal vachomers, but these kal vachomers lead to a wrong conclusion, and therefore, obviously, there's something wrong with this logic. So here's the first one. Lo tutar aninut esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid mikal vachomer. I can prove, you're using your same logic of the kal vachomer, that a kohen gadol who is onen should not be allowed to make a korban yachid. Now that's not true, because a kohen gadol who is an onen is permitted to make sacrifices. But your logic would show as follows. Uma tum'ah sheutera esel kohen hedyot besibur, lo hutera esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid. A regular kohen who is tameh, is permitted to bring a communal offering, and yet when it comes to tum'ah, a kohen gadol who's tameh cannot bring a korban yachid. Aninut shelo tera esel kohen hedyot bekorban sibur. Aninut is more stringent than tum'ah, because a regular Kohen cannot bring a Korban Sibur while in Onen. So if Aninut is more stringent, then Enodin shelo tutar esel Kohen Gadol bekorban yachid. If a Kohen Gadol cannot bring a Korban while Tameh, then all the more so he cannot bring a Korban while he's in Onen. And this would lead to a conclusion that is against the Torah. That's number 1. Second, kal vachomer, that would be incorrect. Ve'tutar tum'ah esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid mikal vachomer. We can prove that a kohen gadol is permitted to bring a korban yachid while tameh, based on this kal vachomer. Uma aninut shelo hutar esel kohen gadol bekorban sibur, hutera esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid. When it comes to aninut, a regular kohen who is in onen is not permitted to bring a communal offering. And yet, a Kohen Gadol who is Onen is permitted to bring an individual offering. So, if we see this stringency regarding Aninut, let's compare it to Tum'ah. Tum'ah she'utera esel Kohen hedyot bekorban sibur. So, if a regular Kohen is Tameh, he can bring a communal offering. That shows that Tum'ah is more lenient than Aninut. So, if so, then this permission should all the more so apply. And Odin she'utera esel Kohen Gadol bekorban yachid. Then an individual Kohen, a Kohen Gadol who is Tameh, all the more so should be able to bring a Korban Yachid. That's the second logic. It's the same logic, just rearranging the phrases, the terms, and it gets to an incorrect conclusion. And the third kal vachomer that he brings is velo tutar tum'ah esel kohen hedyot bekorban sibur mikal vachomer. I will be able to prove that there is no permission for a regular kohen to bring a korban sibur while tameh, which is an incorrect conclusion, but it would follow logically from the same kal vachomer logic. Uma aninut she'utera esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid, lo utera esel kohen hedyot bekorban sibur. If aninut, where it's permitted for a kohen gadol to give a korban yachid while in onen, he's kohen gadol, he's allowed to bring sacrifices while he's in onen. So that's a leniency. and yet regarding aninut, and yet a regular kohen who is on onen is not allowed to bring a korban sibur. Then tum'ah shelo tera esel kohen gadol bekorban yachid. Tum'ah, you see, is more stringent than aninut because a kohen gadol who's tameh cannot bring a korban yachid. So then all the more so, enodin shelo tutar bekohen hejot bekorban sibur, a kohen, a regular kohen who is tameh should not be able to bring a korban sibur. And so this would follow logically, but is in fact not correct halacha. There's a mnemonic for these. Velo tutad, aninut, tum'ah, yachid, ve'yachid, sibur, siman. So, since we can bring all these kavachomes to and lead to false conclusions, therefore Rav's original kavachomen cannot be correct. So, what are we going to do? You could derive this way, you could argue the other way, and since the logic can go this way and that way, you know what? We leave them all as is, and we don't change the halacha. We're not going to learn anything from these kal vachomes because the logic can go both ways, and therefore we're going to stick just to the tradition. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.